So my name is David Goh. I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame. I actually live in South Bend, Indiana, and was also born and raised in South Bend, Indiana. I did my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Notre Dame. Then I left and spent some time working for General Electric Aircraft Engines, now called General Electric Aviation Cincinnati. Got my master's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Cincinnati. Then finished with a PhD in mechanical engineering from Purdue University. So that's an interesting question. When I was considering majors, I was really drawn to two majors. One was mathematics. I was interested in studying Fermat's theorem and chaos theory and sort of a lot of the, I would say, deeper theoretical mathematics, or doing something practical with my aptitude in science and math, and that would be engineering. And really, at the end of the day, it came down to I felt like it would be better for me to do something that's a little more practical, where I could have a little bit greater impact. And I wasn't sure I would be smart enough to do theoretical mathematics either. I knew when I was going into engineering that I really wanted to do something that had to do with fluid dynamics. I thought aerodynamics, the way that cars and airplanes are shaped, was really an interesting field. And so I spoke to a scientist, I guess, at NASA about this, and he recommended that I go into mechanical engineering because I'd get a lot of that in my coursework, and then I could choose my electives to focus in those areas. And then after I graduated, if I really wanted to do it, I could go ahead and get a master's degree or PhD. I could go enter the job force in that area and pursue it. But he felt that being a mechanical engineer gave me the latitude to take my career in a different direction. And when you're 18, that's actually really good advice because you're not exactly sure what you want to do necessarily. So I graduated in 2001 from the University of Notre Dame, and at that time I was contemplating essentially two things. One was going to do a year of service and then going to graduate school to get a PhD. So I looked into about 20 different service programs, some of them more seriously than others. Or I had a job offer from General Electric Aircraft Engines to do what was called their Edison program, which is essentially an engineering training program and a concurrent master's degree. And I thought, well, I could either go get my master's degree, spend some time in industry, and then get my PhD, or do this year of service and then get my PhD. The PhD was always the goal. The goal was always to become faculty. The goal was always to come back and teach. And so I ultimately decided that both from a career perspective, industry experience would be very valuable. And then from a personal perspective, I was contemplating getting married at the time, that it would be good to have a full-time job. So I ended up going down the route of joining GE. I graduated from the Edison program in 2004, went to pursue a PhD at Purdue University. Again, I spoke to various mentors, and the advice I got was Purdue would be a good school that would allow me to pursue a faculty position most effectively. And then I graduated in 2008 and literally walked on Saturday, moved to Notre Dame on Monday, and started the career I'm in now. Again, I was drawn to, obviously, education. My career goal was to become a professor and educator. I also spent a lot of time coaching. I'd coached high school soccer while I was an undergraduate student here, so I was looking for something that would allow me to probably teach and coach. So it was probably the more popular ones are like the Alliance for Catholic Education, ACE, but Teach for America I looked into. I looked into some private organizations. One in particular was an inner city school in Baltimore. I looked into teaching down in Indianapolis as well. Ultimately, what really kind of tipped the scales was my wife ended up doing AmeriCorps And so I kind of felt, well, I'll do it vicariously through her. So while we were engaged, she was in AmeriCorps, and I was working and coaching, actually. So my master's degree was really very much focused on what I was doing at GE Aircraft Engines, which was fluid dynamics and heat transfer for gas turbines. So I was looking at how to keep engines cool and energy efficient so that you could basically build better engines. When I moved on to my PhD, I switched focus with a hope of working in renewable energy. And so when I first started, we were looking at hydrogen fuel cells, were sort of a booming area, and we were looking at ways of storing hydrogen fuel for hydrogen fuel cells. Serendipitously, I got asked to work on a project that not even my advisor, a different advisor, had been offered from Intel, and he knew who I was, and so he reached out to me and asked if I wanted to work on it with my primary advisor as a co-advisor. That had nothing to do with renewable energy. It had to do with electronics cooling. But it was an opportunity to learn some really interesting physics, and someone had given me some advice that your PhD career is really training you how to do research, right? The projects that you work on are your advisors. You don't necessarily get to take them with you. And so I looked at it as a wonderful training opportunity. And then when I started my independent research career as a professor, I knew that I could take it in whatever direction I really wanted to, because a lot of the physical and chemical principles were the same. Yeah, so as a professor at Notre Dame, my job is essentially to both instruct courses, both undergraduate courses and graduate courses, and then to conduct research. I conduct something like 12 different research projects right now. I have a whole group of graduate students and postdocs and a variety of collaborators both on and off campus. My main research area and main teaching area is the thermal fluid sciences, so thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and heat transfer. In my research, there's a caveat to that, is that I actually study plasma science and engineering, which is a charged fluid. And we look at ways that we can manipulate and form these plasmas to do interesting chemistry. So, for example, one of the projects that we're looking at is what we call plasma-enhanced catalysis, where you use plasma as sort of a reactive medium to enhance a catalytic reaction that's occurring at a surface. Another project that we're working on is what we call plasma electrochemistry. We're using a plasma to manipulate the chemistry in a liquid. An application of that is actually water purification. It's also being studied for things like medicine and wound healing and advanced diagnostics and therapeutics. So we're working on various levels of understanding how to create reactive gases and create reactive liquids, and understanding the fluid dynamics, the chemistry, the transport, how that all comes together. Yeah, so I was born and raised Catholic. I came from a very large Catholic family of 8 kids. I'm the 5th of 8. And grew up going to Catholic schools, and then went to a very private Christian school where it was very much aligned with Catholic doctrine. I learned Catholic doctrine in the catechism. I studied scripture for 4 years, etc. And then I came here to the University of Notre Dame. I have always found the Catholic faith to be an important part of my life. I've never really wavered, which is not true of all my siblings. I've had siblings that have wavered. I've had friends that have wavered. But for me, it's always been sort of a rock. A good friend of mine, when we talked about it, he put it in a nice way. He says, it can be frustrating sometimes that the Catholic Church seems to move at a glacial pace. But at the same time, you can go anywhere in the world, and it's the same. And it's always there. And there's the little c Catholic, which is universal. And the big C Catholic, the Church, is universal in the little c Catholic kind of sense. And I find that very comforting, but also sort of fascinating and exciting that I can go anywhere. And whenever I travel, I go to masses all over the world, most of the time not in English, and yet I know what's going on, and understand we're in the liturgy of the word, or I understand the communion rite, and I just find that to be a wonderful part of it. My Catholic faith played a part, not in me necessarily as an engineer in terms of the engineering activities I do, but me as an engineering educator, where I find it very important that myself, and then part of the larger collective of we educators at a Catholic institution, instill our engineers with an important Catholic perspective on what an engineer ought to be and ought to do, right? And probably the easiest way to think about that, or to reflect on that, is obviously Catholic social teaching. There's a phrase that we like to use around here: engineers build a better world. But it's a better world not just for, one particular class of people or one particular group of people. It's a better world in its entirety. And you can interpret that in many ways. If you interpret it from, say, the perspective of Pope Francis's Laudate Si, right? It's building a better world for the environment, right? This is God's gift. If you interpret it from a perspective of human rights, it's a better world where people have access to medicine and water and these fundamental rights of human dignity. And so one of the exciting parts that for me as an educator has been trying to incorporate those principles into my classes. And the best way to do it is through projects. And so, for example, I'm teaching a class right now where the whole project is motivated around developing a solar-powered classroom for a developing nation. Right? A place the students had to do research on finding out nations that don't have consistent electricity access, and they don't have consistent educational access. Right? So there's two problems, and sometimes they're very tightly coupled, and other times they're not. But in this case, we said, well, we can use our engineering skills, and in this case, these are sophomores and juniors, so they're emerging engineering skills to try to solve this problem. And it was inspired by a project I did with an undergraduate where he was actually designing a solar-powered classroom, computer lab actually, for a school down in the Dominican Republic. And so we spent a summer working through all that, and hopefully it'll be installed in the next year or so. And so that to me is really how I've tried to bring my faith into my everyday engineering world, which is really as an educator. I feel like the way it's connected to my faith is that I truly feel like this is my vocation. And not just feel like this is my vocation. I've prayed about this. I've talked about this with people that are close to me in faith and mentoring, about how being an educator, an engineering educator, was the best use of my talent, right? And we look at the gospel of the talents, or I guess it's not the gospel, the parable of the talents, right? And I feel like I have followed my vocation by taking on this role as an engineering educator and an engineering researcher. I mean, those aren't separate and distinct things. They're intimately coupled. My daily engineering life consists of both of them. And so I feel like I am fulfilling my faith, my calling, by what I am doing. But that being said, it's I think, important to be a person of faith in an increasingly secular society, to offer perspective on how you can be someone who's in the sciences or in engineering or in an applied field, and talk about how you balance your faith with objective principles and objective measurements and scientific theory, and questions about whether we believe results or if it contradicts our faith, and what does it mean to have faith in something that you can't measure, right? And so I also think that there's also this interplay that I'm able to talk about these things with people who are maybe outside the faith, which I have, and they're fascinating conversations. So. The funny thing is that it's never ever been contentious. Like it's always been, I've always had very respectful conversations. So when people have asked me about it, I basically say, I see absolutely no contradiction between being a scientist/engineer and being a practicing Catholic and someone who believes in God and believes in Jesus Christ and the resurrection. And when the pushback is like, but you can't always logic that, you can't always reason it. And I said, well, that's the beauty of faith, right? Is as humans we have this ability to be rational and reasonable up to a point. But faith is what gets us beyond that point. And that's where you truly encounter God. And like I said, all my conversations have been very respectful around that point. Sometimes I wish we could have a really drawn out argument, but really, and I don't know if it's just because I say it in a way that's not aggressive or a way that's not overly imposing, but every time I've had that conversation, and to be fair, now that most of the people I engage with are Catholics themselves, so I don't have that conversation as much. But when I was younger, it was always just a very pleasant conversation and debate of ideas. I wish I had something more exciting. I mean, the one person, my wife is not Catholic, and so she's the one who I've had that conversation the most with. Well, first of all, congratulations, you've chosen to be an engineer. I think it's a great calling. I think it's a great career. I think it's a very rewarding career. My advice has with anything, you have to be very conscientious and deliberate in the choices that you make. And so that's a career that's in engineering or not engineering. Certainly, we all aspire to engineering making the world a better place, but there are certainly instances where the engineering is used to not make the world a better place. And there are certainly specific instances where it directly contradicts our Catholic faith and Catholic beliefs. And so it's important that you're deliberate when you make those choices. And I tell every young person, regardless of their career, that you never make these choices in a vacuum. You make these choices with the community that surrounds you. So you get advice from your professors. You get advice from your rector or your priest or your close confidant. And you get advice from your parents. And you get advice from your friends. And really, then you pray, right? And you bring all of that together. And so if you make those choices in a vacuum, that's where I think you can kind of run into trouble. But when you make it in a informed way with a lot of the people that you respect and admire helping you, and they'll help you, we all want to help you, then you'll make choices that I think really kind of merge your faith and your career into one. So actually, I will share what I heard as a high school student, because I actually found it to be very good advice. And so this was at my high school graduation. We had a commencement speaker. And I already mentioned this in terms of my own career, but he talked about your vocation. And he extrapolated beyond sort of the vocation we typically think of the Catholic Church, which of course is the call to religious life, to your personal call to a religious life, and how that affects your choice in the immediate, in this case as a high school senior, what you major in and your career you choose, but then further on, if you decide to have a family or you decide to join the religious life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was important for me at that time to hear that it's not just me picking what I want to do. It's truly a vocation. And for me, that vocation was engineering education. And so any high school student or young college student who's thinking about a career in engineering, it's important to think about it as a vocation. And if this is something that you believe fulfills what the talents and the purpose God has put you on this earth to fulfill. Another project I'm doing that has nothing to do with plasmas is a microfluidics project where we're trying to develop a small chip about the size of my palm, that can take a blood sample and detect what we call biomarkers. So in this case, little micro RNA, which are very similar to DNA, in your blood that are indicative of cancer. And so we're particularly focused on pancreatic cancer, which is one of the most deadly cancers, mostly because you can't detect it early enough to treat it. Basically, you detect it at a point where the only treatment is surgical invasion, and the life expectancy, sort of like the 5-year death rate, is greater than 80%. And so the only way to solve it is to detect it before symptoms arise. And so that's why you need things like early stage biomarkers and ways to analyze them at very minute quantities for that. So that's an exciting project. I work with Chia Chang, who's in chemical engineering here at the University of Notre Dame, on that. Another project that I work on is looking at ways that we can form what we call nanofilaments, so little wires of metal, silver metal, that are only about 100 nanometers long and maybe 50 nanometers in diameter. And we're looking at ways that we can put these into these plastic arrays. So we have a sheet of plastic, and we can create these arrays of these nanofilaments in order to manipulate the properties of the plastic. If it's less than 100 nanometers, you can't see it. The human eye can't resolve that. Point of reference, the hair on your head, let's see, 100,000 times bigger than that. So you can't really see this, but having them in there can manipulate. In this case, we're looking at manipulating light on a very small scale. And so this all goes to what we call metamaterials, which are a catch-all phrase for materials you can't find in nature with properties you can't find in nature. And in this case, we want to create optical properties you can't find in nature. For example, the ability to essentially appear completely transparent to light. The popular phrase is cloaking. But let's be honest, we're nowhere near cloaking right now.